realizing what it meant to so many people came after the process of learning about the show and learning all that stuff. It really started to dawn on me then what it means, for so many people.
What drew me in about this character in particular was that I loved the character before I learned that there was a show about it. And I've been a big PC gamer my entire life, big fantasy genre reader, and to play a role like this was very much a dream come true.
When I first came to this, I knew of Halo sort of peripherally. I'd played when I was a teenager, but not much.
I'm one of these fans. I am one of them, 100%. Rabidly enthusiastic about doing the right thing for this show.
So I was not aware at all of the amount and the depth of the mythology and the story that had already been created.
Big fan of the games and a huge fan of the books as well. And so for me, I'm in the same boat as them. Like, no prisoners.
There's 17 novels. I obviously didn't read all 17 of them yet.
I have been a fan of the fantasy genre since I was a boy. My dad would read to me before I could read, and then any of my free time spent reading has always been, well, more often than not, has been reading fantasy genre. I'm a big PC gamer as well, and so I spent a lot of my time playing role-playing games in that genre and played the Witcher games. I played The Witcher 3 through twice, and then this is the kind of thing I do. This is the kind of thing I do in my free time. So the opportunity to work on this for real and make it my job as well, get paid for doing my hobby stuff, was ideal. And I just wanted to make sure that Geralt was represented as actor.
The reality is, as storytellers and as artists, we have to follow our own instincts, So I had to make my own choices about what was going to be interesting about the role and what was going to be interesting about the character and what was going to be interesting about the series, and then go forward, as strongly and as committed as I could to make the story that I believed was going to be the most compelling and the most interesting.
There's a lot of complexity to Geralt, and you see a lot of that in the books. Some of that doesn't necessarily translate to the show, because due to the nature of there being fantastic storylines which are existing alongside Geralt, had to boil down to the very essence of who he was. And for me, that was a hardline, stony exterior individual who we get to see him come out of every now and again, depending on who he's interacting with. But in the books, we see someone who's a bit more, who has the ability to, or will, openly converse with kings and queens in their language, and then when he's bored of their, don't know how much I can swear on this, rubbish, then he'll be more hardline, and you'll see that transition.
Well, he's a blank slate. He's a symbol for all of us as players when we play Halo. He's a symbol for bravery, for courage, for effectiveness under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And we are him when we play the game. We all are asked to go through the Halo universe as the Master Chief and believe that we're him. And in order to do that, he's kept as a very vague blank slate, as a symbol. So there is no character development. There is no, getting into his personal feelings or thoughts or, how he feels about certain situations, because you're meant to fill those details in with your own personality as you play the game, and you're a co-creator of the experience as a gamer.
What I would say is this has a source material, which is books to draw from, and so there's a story which is already there. And while this is Lauren's version of that story, this is more so a book IP than it is a game IP. Yes, there is a huge fan base based from the games, which is based upon the books. And so I think that is the trick. Cracking the code as far as turning games into live action is still a tricky thing, because the one thing about games is that it's dealer's choice. And that makes things tricky when it comes to watching someone else's vision and someone else's product making all the choices for you.
Yeah. The medium it was established in was a first-person shooter video game. And so, this version of the Chief is my version of the Chief. It contains a huge respect for what Steve Downes achieved as creating the performance of the Chief.
He is this white knight on the inside, and on the outside, he is presenting something which is quite the opposite. And I know in pop culture it's very popular to have anti-hero characters now, and characters who are actually quite mischievous and there's a lot of fun to them. And Geralt is actually just a different access point to the White Knight character, who I'm not saying has fallen out of favor, but is probably at the moment people are going, I want to see someone be a bit bad.
But it's based on my own truth as a human being and my own physical capabilities, one of which includes the tone of my voice and how it sounds. And I have to perform the character in a way that I can connect to and feel authentically attached to, or nobody else is going to connect with the performance at all.
And I think a character like this, when you've lived with him in your head for as long as I have anyway, and then you have the opportunity to play, he's already there in part, and so the next bit is the physicality of it. And so once, as you say, once those lenses go in and the wig's on and the makeup's on and you look a certain way, that's just the final piece, that final step in, and then I start moving differently, I start walking differently, and it just becomes a completely different animal. And so yeah, that is the final ingredient.
It was a no-brainer to accept as a career opportunity just right from the go. You know, you don't get offered the chance to play Master Chief every day.
I'm incredibly fond of this character. And I will fight tooth and nail for him and to do him justice. That's answer enough.
It's fair to say that as video gamers, we've seen our fair share of live-action adaptation misfires over the last few decades. Whether that's a cheap cash grab, misguided reimagining, or something else entirely, Hollywood seems incapable of getting the job done. There's been some limited success, sure, but mostly in the form of the cartoonish general audience pleasers from the likes of Nintendo and Sega. Not that there's anything wrong with that, in fact any opportunity to unleash Jim Carrey on the world is welcomed in my opinion, but when it comes to items of maturity, that is to say M15 plus through to R18, the content has been lackluster at best. Don't worry, I'm not about to dredge up all the shipwrecks, but I say with confidence that there have been more failures than successes. In recent history though, few game adaptations rank higher on the disappointment scale than Netflix's The Witcher and Paramount's Halo. Two massively popular IPs that were more or less butchered on the altar of corporate greed with a generous sprinkle of progressive modernism thrown in there for good measure.
Look how they massacred my girl.
I know it's not fair to call The Witcher a pure game-to-screen adaptation, as it was first a series of novels that spawned a series of games before making its way to the small screen. And the reverse is true of Halo, which was a series of games that spawned a series of novels that had already had a couple of live-action hitouts prior to the release of Paramount's series. Regardless of the specifics of the source material, the popularity of both gaming brands was undoubtedly why the two streamers attempted to cash in on the pre-built audience. Even if they fundamentally fumbled it in the process, but that's another story altogether. What is interesting though was the attitudes of the two show leads, Henry Cavill and Pablo Schreiber. The two men were cast in almost binary opposition in terms of their understanding of their respective franchises' lore, where one lead actor had only a peripheral understanding and chose to double down on the show's writing, direction, and ultimately drove a wedge between him and the long-standing Halo fans come to support the show. The other was a self-proclaimed fan of the books and games, going as far as to warn fans about pending changes before ultimately rebelling against the showrunner's vision, and in time rejecting the show and its portrayal of his character. Before I go any further, neither actor is at fault for their show's writing or direction, and as a general rule, no actor should be used as a scapegoat to that end. I'm sure it wasn't Schreiber's choice specifically to remove the helmet at every opportunity. No more was it Cavill's choice to play second fiddle to the supporting characters in The Witcher. However, once they step into the spotlight to conduct interviews in promotion of the show and offer their own opinion on the matter, they, like everyone, become accountable for the words of their voice. While I'm not naive enough to believe that things like non-disparage clauses and contractual press obligations aren't a thing, there are plenty of examples of actors going off script, either in support or opposition to their projects, and the truth that their feelings can often be gleaned in the subtext of what they say or what they don't.
Well,
Regardless, both The Witcher and Master Chief suffered tremendously under the streaming services to which they were in trust. But where one actor was able to come away with their reputation intact and the fandom on side, the other is now openly mocked for their portrayal and the poster child for all of Paramount's sins. This is not a coincidence, but rather a direct reflection of each fandom's reaction towards the corresponding actor's attitude towards the IP. So let's compare how Cavill was able to play a lore-faithful character in a non-faithful show, earning the respect of Witcher fans in the process, versus how Schreiber approached the Silver Timeline Master Chief, who will be forever known as Jimmy Ring's Master Cheeks. Irrespective of your feelings towards The Witcher and Halo as they stand today, cast your mind back to 2017-2018 when Cavill and Schreiber were cast to play their respective iconic characters. For the most part, both announcements were met with 3 parts excitement and 1 part skepticism. Remember, mathematics isn't my strong suit, so that number is totally arbitrary. While the overwhelming reactions were positive for both actors, as 2017 was a time before the constant entertainment disappointments that we know today, there were still some concerns about the casting. The primary worry around Schreiber was that he would not only be physically playing the Master Chief, but also voicing him, meaning no Steve Downes, a voice that had become both iconic and synonymous with the role. More uncomfortable still was the possibility that there would be more physical face time with the character than in previous appearances. The question of helmet on, helmet off is a loaded one when it comes to Halo fans, and I won't get into it just yet, but rest assured the choice of on or off would have massive repercussions either way, and casting Schreiber without Downes was very much a cause of concern for long-time fans. As for Cavill, on the other hand, many couldn't initially see past the fact that he was already Superman and more or less typecast for the privilege. The fact that he had also been cast in place of Mads Mikkelsen, who was widely considered the fan choice and frontrunner for the role, didn't do much to endear the choice either. But for the most part, fans seemed to agree that both men were suitable choices, and time would tell whether their shows would be any good. With the benefit of hindsight, in both cases, we know that wasn't necessarily the case, at least in terms of canon and lore accuracy. But we weren't to know that at the time. Funnily enough though, knowledge of lore and canon plays a huge part in this story for our 2 leading men. The differences between both actors was evident from as early as their casting. From all reports, Cavill basically refused not to be cast as Geralt from the moment The Witcher was greenlit, seeking out the showrunner before a script had even been completed.
Got in the room with Lauren Hessrick. We had a meeting, and I think a couple of days afterwards she said, look, no, the role's not for you, or it's not right. And so then I was crushed. Then I resigned myself to that. I finished another playthrough of The Witcher, and then they said, look, okay, so they've done casting, and you don't have to do this, but do you want to audition? I was like, no, absolutely I do. This is Geralt of Rivia, and I want to audition. Did a reading, and I think I was given the role later that day.
Cavill swiftly won over Lauren Hessrich, The Witcher's showrunner, with his passion, knowledge and love for the source material, and I'm sure his celebrity status didn't hurt either. I say that because Cavill was not chasing a breakout role with The Witcher, as he was already a Hollywood A-lister in 2018, meaning that Geralt was a role of passion for Cavill rather than a role leading to career renown with just another paycheck attached. Straight out of the gate, Cavill was ticking the boxes to reassure fans of the franchise that he was the right choice for the project, revealing in interviews that he'd read the book, sought out the showrunner, and was a self-confessed fantasy sci-fi nerd. And his clear passion for The Witcher rapidly endeared him to fellow fans. On the other side of the coin, Schreiber was a self-confessed non-gamer, admitting he'd only ever played Halo multiplayer at his friends' houses as a kid, and hadn't completed a story campaign, nor had he touched any of the extended lore. This in isolation is not an issue, and a Halo poor childhood is not necessarily reflective of an individual's preferences as much as it is their circumstances. After all, every actor brings a different approach to their characters anyway. Some go all in on research, others are method actors who deliberately avoid biasing their performance, and many more simply choose to follow the guidance of their writers and directors. In a perfect world, there would be no issue with whatever approach an actor took to a particular part, because the writer and director would be the driving passion behind the project, and in theory, that passion would align to the source material, meaning that regardless of the method, an actor would be walked onto the target by the director. Problems arise though if the actor and writer/director are not in sync, the vision for the adaptation is vastly different from the source material, and or the writer/director has limited or no working knowledge of the source material. Regardless, the stage set was very different for Schreiber, and as such it shouldn't be considered a coincidence that his face is revealed in the first episode of Season 1, despite the mystique of 2 decades without seeing the Master Chief's face directly. This is branding by association, and if the Halo show was the crowd pleaser, it would have correlated to career success and catapulted Schreiber to new heights. But more on that later. Unlike Cavill, Schreiber had yet to break out of his supporting roles and into the position of leading man. Halo would be his first chance to do so. It is therefore fair to conclude that he would have been keen to work with the showrunners to achieve their vision, as apart from being an acting professional, his future success was now tethered to the success of the show. And without pre-knowledge of Halo, or even knowledge as a gamer, he was reliant on the showrunner's vision to shoulder that particular burden. The tensions between source material, writer, director, and actor are a vital piece of this analysis and apply to both Halo and The Witcher. Such tensions, in fact, are considered a driving reason as to why Henry Cavill parted ways with the Witcher series, and why many fans grew to hate the Silver Timeline's take on the Master Chief. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and this is only the beginning of the story. Creative tensions have plagued the concept of a live-action Halo adaptation since its inception in 2001, and the story of how Paramount's show became the last man standing in a long line of proposals is a lengthy one and worthy of its own analysis. But for the purposes of this discussion, the fallout from the failed Halo movie is the important element. There's no way to do the whole failed Halo film saga justice with a wave-top summary, but I'll give the abridged version of the story because it's important for context. It goes something like this. Microsoft wanted a Halo movie, but refused to give up creative control of the project because, likely in 2005, Halo and Xbox were Microsoft's golden goose, bringing them success in the video game industry that was unprecedented at the time of Halo 2's launch. To preserve control of their IP's representation, they contracted Alex Garland to write a script. They then shopped that script around Hollywood with a take-it-or-leave-it deal. The script itself came with a hefty price tag, $5 million in 2005, which is closer to $8 million today, as well as a caveat that a hefty percentage of the profits from the film would go directly to Microsoft. Eventually, Universal and 20th Century Fox agreed to co-finance the movie, with production and domestic promotion being handled by the former and international handled by Fox. Peter Jackson was signed to produce, freshly off the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and with that, the film looked to have the makings of an all-time blockbuster. However, creative differences became apparent very quickly. Upcoming director Neil Blomkamp, who was handpicked by Jackson, clashed with Fox seniors who wanted a conventional PG summer blockbuster and not the dark, gritty sci-fi story that Blomkamp had envisioned Halo to be. Universal and Fox became frustrated with Microsoft's strict adherence to the game's lore and a refusal to adjust the script accordingly. The cost of production quickly blew out and a final script was yet to be completed that pleased all parties. Jackson also famously refused to budge on hiring a different director or heading the project himself to appease the studios, standing firmly behind Blomkamp and his vision for the movie. The details are not exactly clear, but eventually Fox pulled their funding and backed out of the deal, followed shortly after by Universal, leaving Microsoft with a bunch of completed props inclusive of a functioning warthog with no film studio to use them. The movie was put on hold while Microsoft pursued another deal, with multiple scripts being written in the wake of the first attempt. The scripts picked up varying interest from companies like MG and DreamWorks, but never eventuated any further than off-the-record conversations. The production leftovers from Weta, the Academy Award-winning production team from The Lord of the Rings, were used to create the live-action Halo 3 Landfall trailer and subsequently District 9, both directed by Neil Blomkamp and the latter being produced by Jackson. I'm sure that the fact that District 9 was also produced by Sony wasn't a slap in the face for Microsoft either. Ultimately, the entire affair left Microsoft defeated, conceding that the prospect of a feature film was dead and eventually coming to the conclusion that a Halo film based on the games might be too difficult to achieve. Why is this history important to our story? Well, because apparently the lesson learned by Microsoft throughout the whole affair was that making an accurate adaptation of the source material wasn't going to work in Hollywood, where vapid egos are more concerned about the bottom line profit margin or leaving their mark on an established franchise, rather than allowing the creative process to naturally occur under someone's passionate vision that would ultimately please fans and generate a positive return of investment. And I think this can be best captured in two quotes from completely different eras of the journey to make a live-action Halo movie. The first from Wingnut Studios, just after Fox and Universal pulled their support, and the other from Kiki Wolfkill, the former Halo multimedia manager and current executive producer of the Halo series.
Whoops! Not anymore!
The first from Wingnut. At this time, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, along with their partner Microsoft, have mutually agreed to postpone making a feature film based on the Halo video game universe until we can fulfill the promise we made to millions of Halo fans throughout the world that we would settle for no less than bringing a first-class film to the big screen. Given Jackson's work on the Lord of the Rings trilogy and 2005 Bungie Microsoft's strict adherence to the game's lore, it's difficult to see how the film wouldn't have pleased Halo fans. From all reports, Garland's script held pretty close to the events of Halo CE, and Blomkamp's work on Halo speaks for itself, so it's a real shame that the film never got made. As for 343 Paramount, early on we were thinking about doing something that could tie very closely to the game. What we were finding was, trying to verbatim stay with everything that had come before wasn't serving the medium. It wasn't serving the creative teams and their need to express the story and build the world through their eyes. Followed up by the now infamous quote from the showrunner Stephen Kane, "We didn't look at the game. We didn't talk about the game. We talked about the characters and the world, so I never felt limited by it being a game." When you combine the attitudes of 343 and their lack of care for the franchise's lore, just ask a Bungie purist about the Forerunners, Microsoft's hands-off approach to the next adaptation, which basically amounted to let them do what they like so long as we've got a Halo sticker on it, it'll make money, to the writers and showrunners either leaving the project or feeling limited by the franchise's lore and thus ignoring it completely, it's no wonder that the Silver Timeline came out looking like a Halo 5 fever dream from somebody who'd only ever watched someone play Halo 5 on easy.
So why does that matter?
Thank you, Brie Larson having an aneurysm. I'll tell you. It matters because not a single person working on the Halo show, perhaps less some of the people working in the props department, knew or cared enough about Halo's lore to even remotely adapt the source material faithfully, as they were too busy trying to tell their own stories and or too lazy to do any of the pre-reading on the subject. Meaning that when poor Pablo Schreiber was cast to play the Master Chief, he had no guidance on what right or wrong looked like. So when the script told him to act like an autistic child experiencing feelings for the first time, get naked at every opportunity, have sex with a prisoner of war, and put the suit's autojacker in overdrive, of course he gave it everything he had. Because as stated, this was his shot at being a leading man in a massively popular franchise, and he personally had no stake in the franchise's lore because he wasn't a fan. So his performance was guided by the directors and showrunners, which is a recipe for disaster when you consider that the writers weren't fans either. The directors weren't fans, and I struggle to believe that Kiki Wolfkill is a fan, based on how 343 has treated Bungie's lore. Schreiber was set up to fail from the start, both by the studios behind the show that were adapting Halo for the wrong reasons, and by himself for merely wanting to use Halo as a launching pad for his career, rather than wanting to play the Master Chief because he was a fan of the character. Which would probably make all the difference to the fans, as they would be able to see you as a fellow fan fighting against a show being created by people who were not. And although these are important factors in the equation, the real damage came from his interactions with the fans after the fact. But we'll get to that. But speaking of fans...
Burn, butcher, burn!
Henry Cavill was a fan, first of the Witcher games and later the novels, and his mission statement from the outset of his hiring for the Netflix adaptation was simple: that he would continue to play Geralt of Rivia for as long as the show was telling stories that honoured the works of Andrzej Sapkowski, the original author of the Witcher novels. So the fact that Liam Hemsworth is due to play Geralt in Season 4
Really?
should tell you everything you need to know about how that plan went. But that's not to say Cavill departed the series without first fighting to save it. After all, he fought from the start to get cast in the role because he was a fan and wanted the show to do the character justice. But every story's hero needs a villain, so I guess we better quickly chat about Lauren Hestridge. The story of the Witcher adaptation is less intensive than that of Halo, in fact comparatively simple. There was a Polish movie adaptation in 2001. I haven't seen it, but looking at this, it gives me 1993 Super Mario Bros. Vibes.
What is this?
Which probably means that I'd really enjoy it in a morbid, twisted way. When Netflix acquired the screen rights, the project was initially scoped as another film. However, the decision was quickly made to adapt the series into a long-form television show, rather than attempting to cram multiple novels into a 2-3 hour movie. There aren't many details about how Hisrich landed the job as showrunner, apart from being in the right place at the right time. She had proved her worth to the streaming company with shows like Daredevil and The Defenders. As a fantasy fan, she had read the Witcher novels and enjoyed them, so she pitched her idea to Netflix when they were taking expressions of interest. So on paper thus far, we're looking pretty good, but what's important to the story is her bias from the outset.
I connected with the story because of the three main characters, Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri. And really, for me, the most important thing was making sure that every episode came back to one of them, to building them up as these fully fleshed out, complicated, layered characters. Because in the books, though, you meet them through Geralt's lens. So the really, I think, important change that I made was I brought them to the surface really early in the series, and I let the audience meet them before they met anyone else. So they're really built from the ground up, as all humans, men and women, are. So it's really less, I mean, I'm asked a lot if it's a feminist take. I don't know that it is. It's a human take. It is trying to make sure that all of our characters are given the same strong foundation.
Well, no surprises there, I guess. The decision to decrease the focus on the male lead and onto his female counterparts is pretty on brand for a post-2016 story. Don't you think, sexual tension, Squid? Hey, watashimo. Indeed. But there is the beginning of allegedly what became many points of contention between her vision for The Witcher and Cavill's desire to remain faithful to the works of Sapkowski. What is ironic about that, though, is that Hisrich was the one who actually introduced Cavill to the books.
I knew The Witcher from the games, and then I met Lauren, and Lauren told me that there were a series of books as well, which the games were based upon. I had no idea about that. I figured, because all the books had the artwork from the games on there, and so I just figured they were stories related to the games. I was wrong. So I read the books and absolutely loved them.
Meaning that she created her own little lore monster in the process. I think it's hugely important to identify that her vision from the outset wasn't to create a faithful adaptation. It was to use the source material as a vehicle to tell stories about characters that interested her. This inadvertently put her on a collision course with Cavill, whose primary focus was depicting Geralt as accurately as possible, which, I'm sure, would have likely included having him as the focus of the stories for which the character was originally written. I really do think Netflix's Witcher is another example of a writer being given the keys to a toy box that they liked the look of from the outside, but not the toys within. I say that because The Witcher is primarily a story about Geralt. I don't think there's really any refuting that. After all, the games are technically an adaptation too, and they follow Geralt very closely. But Hisrich was determined to have Geralt take a back seat in favour of Ciri and Yen, creating new characters and stories that were inspired by the books, quote unquote. In essence, using The Witcher as a launching pad to tell her own fantasy stories that no Witcher fan asked for. I think the real evidence of that fact is actually her prequel that everybody has already forgotten about. That I'll dredge up to prove a point. You would think a prequel Witcher story about the conjunction of the spheres and the creation of the first Witcher might draw heavily from the novels, tread carefully as to not upset any lore, and be sparing when adding new characters. Well, you're wrong, so shut up. Instead, when the pesky constraints of Sapkowski's writings were removed, Hisrich produced a generic fantasy story about some overpowered diversity champions fighting against racial and classist marginalisation, masquerading as the conjunction of the spheres, in turn tarnishing one of the most important pieces of Witcher world building. So based on that, it's fair to assume that Hisrich had her own agenda at the forefront of her adaptation.
The fact that we go back, we meet Ithlinne as a young woman, we watch her prophesize, and then we watch that come true right before our eyes. To me now, it lends such credence to what we're gonna watch Ciri go through in the main series, and I can't wait. Like, that's one of those little Easter eggs that to me just is going to lend so much to the main series.
Using The Witcher as a vehicle to explore that rather than focusing on the task at hand. Unlike the showrunner, however, Cavill was only interested in playing Geralt as faithfully as possible. It's worth noting that in interviews prior to Season 1, despite the talk of departures from the source material by the show's writers, Cavill spoke passionately about doing his best work with the new adaptation's constraints to play Geralt as envisioned by Histridge, but while also remaining loyal to Sapkowski's work, going as far as to become a proficient horse rider, conduct all his own fight scenes, and bathtub sequences. Actually, I can't even make that joke without flagging it as a point of contention between him and the showrunner. The Witcher arrived in the wake of Game of Thrones, with many people betting that it would in fact be the next Game of Thrones, inclusive of all that very popular nudity. In Season 1, Cavill was the victim of this expectation, but I guess he could see the parallels with the scenes from the games and its importance to his character's intimacy with Yennefer, and thus let it slide in order to honour the works of Sapkowski. However, when the showrunner attempted the same in Season 2, Cavill immediately pushed back. You might say that this is when the cracks began to appear. Cavill's stance on Geralt remained firm from the start. Firm from the start of the project. Honour the works of Sapkowski, which included not debauching them for the sake of viewership, and nudity is but one example. Please note that he also made his stance clear on the matter in the absence of fan backlash, as that fact is an important distinction in this comparison. It was evident though by Season 2 that he and the showrunner were not seeing eye to eye on the adaptation, its characters and Geralt in particular.
It's, for me, the important thing this season was to bring Geralt as close to the books as the vision and the plot would allow. And it's very easy to fall down the line of him being the grumpy snowman, and,
Sure.
and there's a comedy aspect to that, and I wanted to lean away from that.
Another, now infamous example, is the scene of Roach's death in Season 2. Hissrich had originally planned for Roach's death to be punctuated with topical Marvel-esque meta-humour, but Cavill hated the idea, eventually arguing to have a line lifted from the books and to play the scene with a straight and very sad bat.
Enjoy your last walk across the meadow and through the mist. Be not afraid of her, for she is your friend.
And if rumours are to be believed, this apparently became a common theme throughout both Seasons 1 and 2, with Cavill omitting, altering and adding dialogue from the books in the place of what was originally scripted. While this evidently went unnoticed or unmolested by the showrunners and directors, it did not go unnoticed by the fans, who were extremely grateful they had a literal lore champion working on a show plagued by pretenders. And that's not even mentioning the controversy that implied that many people working on the show actively disliked Sapkowski's books. While Cavill maintained outward professionalism on set and while promoting the show, it's interesting listening to the verbal gymnastics he conducted when asked certain questions.
It's with, especially what Lauren's done. She's come onto this and she's been very courageous, taking on such a popular IP.
Yes.
And she, as I say, she's brought her own vision to this. In the books, we have 3 major characters, one of which doesn't really get introduced until the second book, and one of which gets introduced at the end of the first book. And otherwise, you're just following Geralt.
Mm-hmm.
And Lauren has brought her a far broader lens to this TV show. And we have these 2 fantastic characters, Yennefer and Ciri, who are introduced from the very beginning. And so to draw parallels between the books and the TV show is going to be very, very difficult from the beginning.
Yes.
Because we have 3 major characters from the get-go rather than 1. The essence of everything is the same, and people will recognize certain elements of the books, but this is very much a broader lens version of what the books represent.
The audience is who this is for.
Yep.
And I listen to them, and I think it's very important to listen to an audience and see what everyone's saying. So even if you didn't nail it the first time, you can start to adjust, you can start to tweak, you can start to sort of caress it into something which does honor to the amazing material that Sapkowski created.
Yeah.
I am effusive about getting the being loyal to the source material. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
If you believe what you're doing is the right thing, then you'll be able to keep on doing it. It's also important to know that if you realize you're doing the wrong thing, that's when you stop doing the wrong thing. You don't just keep on going just because that leads down a dark path.
These various clues shine some light on Cavill's frustrations with the show, as the production leaned further and further away from the source material. Despite this though, Cavill stood as a bastion of hope for fans, even as the show continued to self-implode with its own interests. His constant defense of the law and commitment to Geralt ultimately separating him from the end product, to the point where the fandom demanded Netflix sack the writers to keep Cavill in the role when rumours that he would be leaving the show began to surface. I guess the old idiom rings true, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, and if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Regardless, Cavill was just one man surrounded by people that didn't share his love or mission, and he ultimately stepped away from his dream role rather than continue to be part of what I'm sure he began to consider a subversion or an unworthy adaptation of Sapkowski's novels. I personally admire this. Everyone has a price, and many would have taken the guaranteed paycheck, but not Cavill. For him, the respect for the material was more important than the money and more important than his acting prospects. And if I was to sum up Cavill's actions on behalf of Geralt, I would say he talked the talk and then walked the walk. Quite literally in the end. That's what commitment and respect to the source material actually looks like. And it's not just lip service to appease faceless fans. Because I guess it's hard for fans to remain faceless when you're looking one in the mirror every day. And this conviction has been what's lacking from many modern adaptations. This is what separates artists from pretenders. It's the difference between the Lord of the Rings and the Rings of Power. And it's the difference between the Witcher games and the show. Passion, respect, and actual actions towards those ends. Cavill proved time and time again that he could work within the constraints and limitations put on him by Hissrich to remain faithful to Sapkowski's work, all while not attacking the showrunner, writers, or anyone else who attempted to disparage his mission. And if one man with a clear vision can overcome such obstacles and deliver a lore-faithful Geralt despite all the efforts to the contrary, it's sad to think what could have been if the showrunner and creative team were on the same page as their leading man. So despite the disappointing end to Geralt's story as played by Cavill, he walked away with the fans firmly on side, whom I'm sure would be happy to watch him return to the role if it was helmed by a writer and director that shared his passion and vision. I know I certainly would. But if that's what right looks like, let's take a look at what happens when a leading man lacks the knowledge and understanding of the franchise's lore, and it's put in the hands of showrunners who are equally divorced from the responsibility of creating a faithful adaptation, all of whom working for a company that seems to actively despise the very franchise that they're custodians of.
I am a monument to all your sins.
I've said enough about not blaming Pablo Schreiber for the decisions of the writers.
My job as an actor is to bring to life the vision of the showrunner. And on season 1, the showrunner was Stephen King, and it was my job to bring to life his vision for the show.
But before I unleash the Kraken, I want to say that the following analysis comes from a place of good faith, and isn't just bashing for the sake of bashing.
My ass!
Whether you believe that based on my previous reviews of Halo is ultimately your choice. But I will no longer caveat every point I make with, please remember that the man is just an actor doing his job. Okay, Schreiber took a very different approach to his portrayal of John 117, choosing not to immerse himself in the lore, conduct any research outside of watching some Halo cutscenes, or even speak to the original voice actor.
I've never spoken with Steve. We've exchanged some pleasantries on Twitter. I personally am a huge fan of Steve and the work that he did in establishing the character of the Chief over the last 20 years. One of the key pieces of my research was all the cinematics from the games, which contain his performance, over the past 20 years.
There's nothing wrong with professional distance as an actor, and I regularly cite Gary Oldman's performance as Sirius Black in Harry Potter as an example of when this can work. However, an actor distancing themselves from biasing their performance only works when the writer, and more importantly director, know what they are doing. This was not the case with Halo. The original showrunner left mid-production. The replacement showrunner wasn't a fan. The directors weren't fans, and the vision greenlit by Paramount was anything but faithful. The collective production team behind Halo seemed to really underestimate the level of expectation for, and importance of, getting the series right. After all, some fans had been waiting for this project since the original film was announced all the way back in 2002, and sadly, no one is more guilty of misunderstanding the responsibility of finally bringing Halo to live action than Schreiber. As I've said, I believe Schreiber was in the game for the wrong reasons, chasing career clout rather than seeking to actively portray a much-loved character, which goes a long way to explaining some of his interactions with the fans that he seemingly, and almost immediately, went to war with almost as soon as he was cast. His casual dismissal of the video game storytelling medium, paying lip service to respecting the law and Steve Downes, coupled with his active antagonisation of fans that were critical of the Silver Timeline, rapidly painted a picture of a man who was wearing the suit without any real appreciation of what it meant to fans. Ignorance is not an excuse for a poorly written and executed performance, and the willful blindness of the showrunners, writers, directors, and their leading man is inexcusable in this instance, all of whom used the same catchphrase as an excuse for their failings.
Optimizing for the medium and optimizing for telling this character story.
But we also set out to do something differently with the show, intentionally. But it also felt important in order to be able to tell a good story on television, because at the end of the day, it's about optimizing for the medium and give players a way of experiencing Halo that they don't get to do in the games.
On behalf of gamers everywhere, particularly Halo fans, let me just say that is fucking horseshit. That is a convenient straw man argument placed to draw fire away from the fact that the writers of the show were too lazy to do any research into the lore of Halo, at least any research deeper than looking at a coffee table picture book, or were too incompetent to write a story that worked within the boundaries of that canon. I am personally sick to death of this excuse being used as a justification for poor adaptations. If your writers can't or won't play by the rules of the canon, hire new writers. Saying the medium doesn't serve the storytelling is ridiculous when things like Arcane, The Last of Us, and Halo Legends exist. The latter being proof that you can tell non-canon stories that work on their own so long as you respect the source material. Hisridge pulled this same shit with The Witcher, only to have Cavill fly in the face of her lies with his performance and commitment. The truth of the matter is that these writers, who aren't fans of the source material, just want to tell their own stories. And that would be fine if they weren't working on a pre-established IP with 20 years of lore attached to it. Placing a show in a different timeline doesn't excuse it from the pre-established lore. In fact, it arguably makes that lore more important. Because when a timeline change is done well, competent writers can tell amazing stories that add gravitas to the original timeline, drawing comparisons between what is and what could have been, for better or worse. But in these instances, the respect is always there, and it wasn't in the Silver Timeline. The constant condescension of the video gaming medium from Schreiber in his interviews quickly alienated longtime Halo fans, saying that the core Halo timeline wouldn't work in the television medium because the character of Chief is merely an avatar for the player. I personally believe that Schreiber adheres to the classic Hollywood elitist opinion that still believes video game storytelling amounts to side-scrolling to a castle to rescue a princess. But storytelling in video games has long since moved past this reality, and everyone who is a Halo fan knew that. While his comments are partially true, at least provisionally, it is an oversimplification of Chief's role in Halo. Chief in the games is a two-dimensional character that drives the external change and action in the story, which is very different to a three-dimensional character that undergoes an internal change, usually to overcome a flaw or misbelief. It's the difference between Alan Grant and the T-Rex in Jurassic Park. The T-Rex is a two-dimensional character, and a constant that drives the external change of the park and the action of the story. Whereas Grant, swept up in that external action, undergoes an internal change, overcoming his dislike for children to be a man ready for fatherhood at the end of the film. Only to have his entire character arc undone in Jurassic Park 3, but that's another story. The two-dimensional character is a basic archetype that drives change in the characters and the world around them. They don't undergo change themselves because they have no character flaw, so to speak. But that doesn't mean they lack character traits and are just a blank slate. That would be incredibly boring. In Halo, Chief is the anchor for the human Covenant war, around which the plot and other characters evolve. He is the archetypal hero, the dependable soldier who gets the job done no matter the cost, usually while delivering some witty one-liner.
Thought I'd try shooting my way out. Mix things up a little.
By attempting to change Chief into a three-dimensional character with self-identity flaws, both the writers and Schreiber completely altered the DNA of Halo, and it was totally unnecessary. Halo didn't need to force Chief to become a three-dimensional character because his internal journey is not the point of the story. Halo is a sweeping sci-fi epic about the struggle of humanity against the genocidal Covenant. What changes in the story is the external conflict and state of the galaxy between the two factions, as driven by Chief. Because of this constant, other characters are able to undergo classic three-dimensional character arcs, like Miranda, the Arbiter, and Cortana, all of whhom are products of that external action of the war. A television show could have easily achieved this within its medium, anchoring the stories of regular humans to Chief as they fight their way through the Human Covenant War and undergo internal changes. You know, a bit like this scene in Halo Infinite.
You should leave me here with the rest of the garbage.
We all fail. We all make mistakes. It's what makes us human.
See, even the morons at 343 got this right, even if it did take them 3 games and several massive course corrections to achieve. But I guess this version of Chief would have required competent writers in the first instance and people who actually understood Halo and its lore, none of which were present in the Halo show, but I digress. Because Schreiber didn't understand Chief and had a personal stake in the show's success, in the wake of backlash following Season 1, he ignorantly doubled down on the creative decisions of the showrunners, steadfast in the view that his take on Chief was the only workable version for a long-form television show, only conceding ground when it became clear that he and the show were on the wrong side of the argument. But unlike Cavill, who came out against Geralt's sex scenes on behalf of the character ahead of time, Schreiber doesn't get any points for agreeing that his sex scene was cringe, forced, and totally out of place, namely because it amounts to having an opinion after you know which way the wind is blowing, rather than making a stand and risking a controversy. But speaking of controversy, the helmet. It's a question as old as Halo itself. Does it stay on, or does it come off? I personally believe it should have stayed on, despite Chief taking it off in the books, because it's more in keeping with the representation of his character in the visual medium. While Chief in the novels approaches something akin to a three-dimensional character with or without the helmet, the general Halo audience knows him as the two-dimensional character from the games, so it makes the most sense for a television adaptation to leave it on and use him as the two-dimensional character that drives the action of the show, as we discussed. That's not to say that a three-dimensional Chief wouldn't have worked in the Silver timeline, it just would have required far more work from the showrunners. First developing the Chief as a Spartan soldier within the greater UNSC fighting the Covenant, before peeling back the armour to look at the human underneath, rather than racing to this end state in the first episode without giving new viewers any context into the Spartan program and their ultimate war with the Covenant. But this isn't a conversation about the incompetence of the show's poorly focused narrative, it's about Schreiber's attitude towards playing the Chief. Pablo Schreiber was adamant that the helmet had to come off.
It's tailoring the medium, the entertainment for the medium, right? The Halo is a first-person shooter game, and so Chief has always been kept as a symbol, very vague character that you don't really get to know because you're meant to be him. You put yourself in that position and fill out all the details of the personality with your own. We're making a TV show, and in order to have an audience connect with the character over the course of a long-term TV show, there's no way you can pull an audience through that without getting to know the character, without relating to the character, without empathizing with the character. And that feels virtually impossible to do with a helmet on all the time.
And that's all great stuff, had a three-dimensional Chief not already been realised as part of the various Halo novels that have been published. But that is an absolute rabbit warren that we will avoid for the time being.
So this is a new form of entertainment, it's a new medium, it's a chance for people who have played as Chief for so long to put the controller down, sit back on the couch, enjoy the experience of learning about the Chief in a way that you have never done before. And, I think it's an opportunity for all of us to get to know him in a better way.
Demonstrating a complete lack of awareness to the concerns of the fans. Worse still, his defense of the decision came across as arrogant condescension towards legacy fans for their seemingly childish views of wanting to see the hero from their favourite video game franchise accurately represented on screen. Schreiber maintained that without taking the helmet off, the audience would have no way to connect to Chief emotionally. Never mind that at the same time Halo aired, there was another show about a man in a set of armour that demonstrated just how nonsensical this argument was.
And you don't have the real-world rules against it like you do in The Mandalorian. If The Mandalorian takes his helmet off, he's not a Mando anymore. In Halo, the Spartans take their helmet, their Mjolnir off constantly. They have a whole life outside of it. The only rule about not taking your helmet off is the one about Chief not taking his off because you're meant to believe you're him.
Are you mentally handicapped?
Ultimately revealing it as just more ill-informed justifications on behalf of the show's creative choice. An actor's facial emotions are just one tool that can tell an audience how a character is feeling. But again, this argument in isolation is a massive oversimplification that doesn't take into account subtext, cultural differences, and even maturity levels. An actor's face doesn't tell the audience how to feel. Filmmaking does. Things like the score, lighting, blocking, camera movement, editing, and the actor's posture are all elements that work towards this end. Why do you think we connected with Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi, despite him being the villain up until this point? It's because the filmmaking was competent enough to support the ideas within the script. Imagine the same argument being used in V for Vendetta, with Hugo Weaving insisting the audience needed to see his face to connect with the character of V. It's ill-informed nonsense designed to gaslight the audience into believing that the creative choice of revealing John's face was the only option for the show. But as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's a coincidence that we got to see so much face time with Jimmy Rings. It's basically a meme at this point about how often he tries to take his helmet off. But why? Well, as I said, it's branding by association. I wouldn't be surprised if the helmet piece was written into Schreiber's contract, because he doesn't even wear it for the promotional posters of Season 2. Schreiber is using Halo's IP to sell himself, not the Master Chief. But unfortunately, Pablo had to spit in the face of pre-existing fans in order to achieve this, which wouldn't have been physically possible if he was wearing the helmet in the first place. Ironically enough. It's sadly the only explanation that fits without me entertaining some wild conspiracy theory about 343 trying to destroy everything Halo was under Bungie. Although I've seen plenty of decent arguments to support that theory too. But I'll avoid that subject, at least for the purposes of this dive. But this is probably the crux of the issue, the fact that Schreiber sided with the showrunners in total opposition to the fans before the show aired, blindly following the words of poor custodians as they debauched, altered, and subverted the IP without even attempting to understand what the character meant to fans. A casually cruel and willing tool for the corporate creation committee's execution of Halo, and in the process unwillingly biting the hand that for so long fed the franchise that the show was based on. An adaptation hinges on its pre-existing fans to survive first contact with a new medium, and if those fans are disrespected from the outset, the new adaptation is unlikely to last long enough to cultivate new ones. And without fans, a franchise is nothing more than an empty ship adrift at sea. At the end of the day, it is respect for the source material that separates Cavill from Schreiber, despite them both on paper having ample cause to blame the showrunner for the portrayals of their characters. And when the respect for the franchise's origin was absent on behalf of the showrunner, writers, and directors, Cavill stepped up to champion the Witcher's law. His clear mission to be authentic as possible to the source material while working within the constraints imposed on him by the showrunner is a testament to his passion and professionalism. Literal proof that it is possible to work within creative constraints to deliver a faithful performance, as long as your vision and mission are clear. This is why he was able to walk away with the fandom behind him, because in every sense of the word, he was a fan himself. He wanted the best for Geralt as a fan of the franchise. Schreiber, however, earned the ire of fans, not just because he was a willing instrument in Paramount's terrible take on Halo, but because he failed to respect the character or pay appropriate reverence to the source material or its medium of origin, mounting his high horse before the show even aired to tell fans to shut up and get behind his version of Chief, only to step over the edge of the abyss and into a maelstrom of pseudo-intellectual socio-scientific telenovela fanfiction, waxing lyrically about the cognitive dissonance of fans while he got high on the smell of his own hubris rather than conceding that the show may have gotten it wrong. The fans of a franchise are a force unto themselves, and it's something that Hollywood has never understood when it comes to video game adaptations. The fans can be your greatest ally or your worst enemy, and pleasing them is not to be taken lightly. A built-in franchise audience are stubborn and proud creatures, having often spent years ingesting the content, and they are likely to know more than you, particularly if you self-admit that you weren't a fan. They are not a guaranteed payout that will enjoy your work simply because it has the right sticker on it. You have to earn their trust. You have to assure them that you have their favourite work's best interest at heart. You have to prove that you are worthy of the mantle, that you are a fitting custodian. After all, they are the ones who put the franchise up on the mantle to begin with. They may not have created it, but it survives because of their passion. Don't get me wrong, the royal we, fans, can be absolute crybabies about the things we love. We can be fickle and at times totally unpleasant. But, as Cavill rightly observed,
I understand what you're saying, but when it comes to fans, it is a fan's right to have whatever opinion they want to have. And people are going to be upset because, especially when you're talking about books or games, because you're never going to be the exact person who they had in their head or who they played on Witcher 3, for example. I don't necessarily consider that toxic. I just consider that passionate.
When you're coming into a franchise, you don't get to choose which fans come with you. By entering the arena, you have to accept whatever shit is thrown at you, the good and the bad. But all that noise comes from a place of passion. Sure, it could be better articulated, but a lot of the time, that noise is warranted. The pre-existing audience are the reason you're getting a chance to adapt a game in the first place, so test their patience at your peril. Cavill understood this. This is why a lot of the promotional material in the lead up to The Witcher's premiere featured him talking about Sapkowski, talking about Geralt, talking about witches and their lore. He was committed to reassuring the fans that he was the right man for the job. He was determined to win the fans over. He knew that being cast in the role didn't automatically make him Geralt to the collective fandom. He had to first earn the fans' approval before being accepted as their Witcher. Cavill as Geralt was not a given, it was earned because he understood what Geralt meant to fans, because he was one. Schreiber, on the other hand, couldn't even answer why Halo was important to him, because it wasn't. And because he didn't care about the character, he didn't care what the audience would think about the adaptation either, because he wasn't playing Chief. He was playing his chief, and he failed to realise that regardless of how many times he said the show was doing its own thing, comparisons were always going to be drawn between what the fans were promised versus what they got. When you take custodianship of a character, you then have to shoulder all the criticisms that come with it, regardless of whether your version is different to what came before. No actor who played Batman was ever free from criticism, but at the end of the day, the character was never about them. And for the most part, they understood that. Schreiber did not. Schreiber took the audience for granted from the start, and whether he believed the work would speak for itself to sell him as chief, or he simply didn't care, is unclear. What is clear is that the majority of Halo fans hated the Silver timeline, and rather than conceding or apologising, he doubled down. Failing to understand that fans were upset not necessarily because the story was different, but because his version of Chief was so far removed from the Chief that came before, they may as well be totally different characters. That his version now stands in the spotlight after 20 years, and it doesn't even come close to what fans had hoped for, or even comparable to the Chief from the core timeline. But as I said, Cavill and Schreiber are merely a window into the wider problem that is Hollywood's attitude towards video game adaptations and adapting franchises in general. Modern studios are inheriting lore-rich franchises without taking the time to learn or care about them, only to throw out the bits that they don't like or understand in favour of the flavour of the month or whatever their personal preferences are, without first considering how that will affect the lore and the fandom. And in the case of The Witcher and Halo, self-ego stroking was 100% the villain here. From Lauren Hess-Rich choosing to basically rewrite all of Sapkowski's stories to heavily feature Yennefer and Ciri, often at the expense of The Witcher because that's what she wanted, to Schreiber and Wolfkill adamant that Schreiber's face was more important than 20 years of lore, despite how long fans had waited for the Halo show. In both instances, they forgot the reason they got the job in the first place: the source material. And the fans that made it the global success it was, fans like you, me, and Cavill. And as long as studios continue to take these franchises for granted, they will keep disappointing their audiences, whose inevitable passionate criticism will ultimately be weaponized against them in order to protect the showrunners from any accountability. Passion, respect, and professional mastery are the key ingredients to a faithful adaptation. But more than that, a clear vision is required to align all the parties to the mission at hand. Without that, no matter how good individual elements are, whether it's the leading man, props, music, or script, the adaptation will falter. And if you don't stand as one, your project will fracture and fail. There are no free hitouts when it comes to live-action video game adaptations, partly because film has always been considered the superior older brother to video games in terms of storytelling. Whether that's fair or still true is still open for debate. But because film is considered the great equaliser, excuses like the canon doesn't serve the medium doesn't fly. All that says to this jellyfish is that you are not worthy of the opportunity you've been provided. Because unlike games, which can end up in a discount bin for a console that no one will ever play again, bad film is not so easily forgotten, and ultimately tarnishes the brand that stood in the sun of global success before Hollywood got their greedy, untalented tentacles on it. The irony is not lost on me. The current climate of Hollywood is not right for video game adaptations. Not that it'll stop the greedy bastards from trying, But in my opinion, there are very few, if any, people working in the industry today that possess the necessary ingredients required for the successful adaptation so many of us have been waiting for. Don't get me wrong, some haven't been terrible in recent history, ranging from good to good with caveats to downright serviceable, but I think the horse has bolted on The Witcher and Halo for the time being. Hey, maybe Cavill can pull something special out of the bag with his Warhammer 40k series, but only if the team behind him shares his vision and brings all their professional mastery to the table to support it. Nothing short of a collective team of talented filmmakers will come even close to producing something worthy of that mantle. But at least I can say there will be passion and respect behind the project, unlike Halo and The Witcher. But remember, I'm just a brainless lump who laments the wasted potential of both Halo and The Witcher, drifting on the slow-moving current of hope that one day things will improve. Hooroo.